So it's now my pleasure to bring back to the stage President Bollinger, who really is, as I said earlier, he's really responsible for a renaissance in relationships with alumni. When I became a trustee a few years ago, I was watching what he was doing. I was learning a lot, really getting a crash course in Columbia. And one thing he said to me, I said, well, what are the things that are important to you? And he said, having the big idea is really what makes a university great. And Manhattanville is a big idea. There are other big ideas, and I just sort of put things in that framework when I look at our global centers, when I look at other things that are going on. So President Bollinger is somebody that I'm very proud to work with. In addition to making the university a very exciting place and reaching out to alumni, he also has a special place in his heart for journalism, which is my field. This past fall, he taught a course, A Free Press for Global Society, focused on issues that he addresses in his most recent book, Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open, A Free Press for a New Century. President Bollinger.
Well, thank you again, Alilia. And it's wonderful to have you on the Board of Trustees and doing this. We have the last panel here as a very, very significant topic, and that is global media, global press, global understanding. But because of the nature of that discussion, inevitably we will take up the press generally. And there are a lot of things to discuss there. So we have three, as I said, panelists, and let me introduce them very briefly before we start. Julius Genachowski is chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, of course, as you know, an agency he previously served in several capacities, including chief counsel to then Chairman Reed Hundt. Under his leadership, the FCC has worked to expand broadband capacity across the United States and has tackled the controversial issue of net neutrality. After law school, he served as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justices William Brennan and David Souter, and he is a graduate of Columbia College. Claire Shipman is a senior national correspondent for Good Morning America. Before joining ABC News, she was the White House correspondent for NBC News and spent a decade with CNN. Over her career, she has covered a remarkable series of historic events, including Tiananmen Square, the aborted Soviet coup, and subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin's assault on the Russian Parliament building, and the Oklahoma City bombing. More recently, Claire has reported from Iraq and on the 2008 presidential election. Her exceptional journalism has been honored with multiple awards. She is a graduate of Columbia College and the School of International Affairs, Public Policy and International Affairs. Nicholas Lemann is the dean of our Graduate School of Journalism and the Henry R. Luce Professor of Journalism. When he came to Columbia in 2003, and we were incredibly lucky to entice him to become dean, he was serving as the New Yorker's Washington correspondent, an experience that no doubt will enter into his discussion today. He's been responsible for leading the journalism school during a transformative period for the profession and has responded with an incredible array of innovations in the school. He has published 5 books and continues to write for the New Yorker. So that's the group. Let's begin. I will sit down just a second, but I'll use this mic with Claire. And I think since we're beginning, our focus is sort of global media and understanding of international issues, and you've had this deep, long experience with major press organizations, and especially in the broadcast area. If you could talk about how you see those institutions now and their capacity or incapacity to cover international global events, that would be a great start for us.
Absolutely. At least you didn't say I've just bounced around from place to place. It sounded much more elegant.
Yeah.
But one more network, and I probably will have covered them all. It's remarkable when I think back to the state of affairs when I was in Moscow for CNN and the way, things work both at CNN and what I observed very closely from the way the networks operated, and watching, for example, what is the reality today. The investment in covering foreign stories has plummeted. This is probably not a surprise to many of you who read papers or watch television, and that's been a long-standing slide. But when I think about the time I spent, for example, in 1991 in Moscow, and the kind of coverage we and the networks really provided, covering the aborted coup and Gorbachev and the transition, the end of the Soviet Union, I think we probably had 1 or 2 stories on the air every day for 6 months. And we also had the ability, because we had a full bureau there with people who had, I was a lot younger then, but I did have my Harriman Institute certificate and my international affairs degree, and I had some experience in Russia, but we had a full team of really experienced reporters and producers on the ground that I think really gave our coverage a distinction. But the networks had the same thing. I mean, the networks were really heavily invested as well. And when I look at what's happened, for example, now in the way the spring, the Arab Spring is unfolding and everything going on in the Middle East, the coverage is riveting. It's very exciting, and it's especially exciting to watch what is happening with Facebook and Twitter in driving that revolution, as we were talking about. The networks have given it a lot of coverage when it's hot, but it also fades very quickly, I think you'll see from the headlines, and it just doesn't stay. If you wanted to find out what's going on in Egypt, I don't think there's been a lot of continuity in terms of that story on the network news lately. So I think we've seen, look, across the board, we've seen a slashing of, probably 50% at ABC, a lot like everywhere else over the years. I mean, it's a huge cut, and it's felt in terms of, the ability to go out and be in places for long periods of time, whether it's with a bureau, whether it's, extended stays in a country, but to bring that depth of knowledge to bear that helps to compel things to get on the air. But we also feel it, we do feel it in domestic news as well, and we feel it in our ability to do domestic investigative journalism. There's just less of an appetite for me at Good Morning America. If I'm proposing something that would take 2 or 3 weeks to work on, that would be almost impossible for me to convince anybody of now. A couple of days of spending on shooting is just about all anybody can stomach. So I think it's, we were at a big party in Washington recently, and a very prominent politician said, he was looking at what happened in Egypt, and he said, this is so exciting. Mark Zuckerberg is like the Thomas Jefferson of our generation, or the James Madison. And we thought about that, and what Facebook has done is enormously exciting, and in a lot of ways, I see a lot of parallels to the role CNN played in the coverage of the Soviet coup. CNN was just being broadcast in Moscow at that point, and that access was incredibly important for informing the Russian people what was going on. And it was by mistake, by the way. Somebody was supposed to flip that switch off, and they forgot. And it was broadcast all across Moscow, and everybody knew what was happening and what to do. And it's similar, but I guess I will leave you with that question about whether, is Mark Zuckerberg the Thomas Jefferson of our generation, or is there, is he the creator of an incredible tool?
So here's the problem. I'm supposed to be the moderator.
I'm sorry, but I'm a reporter.
But I have intense feelings about that question, and I can't resist it. And I want to be provocative, so we have an interesting panel. I would say it's incomprehensible to think of Mark Zuckerberg as Thomas Jefferson. That one. So I'm putting this out as a hypothesis. So one person's distinction is based on content, on ideas, and the other person's is on inventing. It's a very significant achievement to invent something that is a communications technology, but I wouldn't say that they may be comparable in terms of the effects on the world, but I wouldn't put them in the same category. And And I want to turn this over to Julius because I think he disagrees with that.
Well, no. I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think the more apt analogy might be with Gutenberg.
Right.
Because the platform of the internet as a way for people to receive information, to share information, and now on top of that, the social networking activities, tools like Facebook, like Twitter, are having just a profound effect on the world at every level, from what we've seen over the last few weeks in North Africa, in the Middle East. Wouldn't have happened without new communications technologies, to the effect on journalism in the United States, query whether the rise of the internet, the challenge to traditional business models is part of the reason that Claire is seeing what she's seeing. Certainly on a local level, we're seeing effects like that. But just to stay with Egypt and North Africa for a minute, a lot of people asked when the internet was shut down in Egypt and mobile service was shut down. Wow, how could they do that? What does this mean? Very important questions. They raise very difficult issues. But less frequently asked was the question of how did it happen that Egypt had an internet and a mobile service that was worth shutting down? And that's its own really interesting topic. Underneath it is a revolution that's happened around the world in the rollout of communications infrastructure like mobile and to a certain extent like the internet. That's good. And it's raising a whole series of profound new issues around, more visible now after the last few weeks, around whether a free and open internet is sustainable worldwide, sustainable globally, versus the risks of a balkanized internet, which would be tragic, in my opinion, both from a free speech and human rights perspective, also from a global prosperity and global economic perspective. So I've thrown out a few issues, but I'm going with Gutenberg.
So Julius, on this, so Claire paints a picture of traditional press organizations, institutions, as having cut back severely on their capacity to cover global affairs, international affairs. And probably we can take that as I think, a given of the discussion, right? I mean, we all know that every major press institution in the United States, almost all of them, except perhaps the financially oriented ones, right, are really pale versions of what they were 10 years ago or certainly 20 years ago. I think I would ask this question of you. To what extent is that a matter of public policy? And what forms of public policy? Clearly, what you've started talking about is very, very important. That is, you've been very, very big on universal access to the internet. So if you could talk more about that and what that means for this reality, and anything else that's a matter of public policy that relates to this reality.
Well, so much of public policy in the media area, and I'm sitting next to the real expert on this, has been driven for the last 50 years by certain scarcities. Whether it was a limited amount of spectrum allocated for broadcasting that gave us only a certain number of over-the-air channels in particular communities, or whether it was economics that created, in effect, one newspaper and no more than one in almost every market in the country. And so that those elements of scarcity led to certain kinds of public policies that were adopted over the years that either made sense or didn't, but you know, they formed that discussion, that debate. We're in a completely different world now, or at least we're in a transition to a completely different world, presuming that the internet stays free and open and that it becomes something that everyone has access to. And so the questions for public policy are very different, not in a world of scarcity, what to do with respect to content that's either not there or that is there but is problematic, but rather issues that stem from the nature of the internet. One of the big issues, I think, is how do we preserve the character of the internet that's been open, that's been characterized by freedom? How do we preserve that in the United States? How do we make that our chief export, or one of our chief exports, to the rest of the world? That presents a lot of public policy issues. How do we make sure that everyone has access to broadband? Those create public policy issues. And then there's a third category, and I know Nick's been doing work on this, which is this question of, okay, in this new world, will there or won't there be categories of content that's important for citizenship, important for participation in our democracy, important for participation in our economy, that may not be provided?
Yep.
What are those categories? If they're important and they're not going to be provided by the internet, big if, what, if anything, should public policy do about that? So I think we're all at the relatively early stages in identifying the questions, starting to do the work to analyze it. We're doing some work at the FCC. Nick's been doing a lot of work at the J School. But they're different questions than the public policy questions that have been asked for the last 50 years.
Nick, what do you think about all this?
Well, I think about it a lot. I want to say first, you know, in his famous manifesto for founding National Review, William F. Buckley wrote, "My aim is to stand athwart history yelling stop." There is a tremendous temptation to do that in journalism these days, but it's impossible, and it's not a useful role for Columbia Journalism School or our profession generally. So what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do as a journalist and citizen and dean, and what our school, I believe, is trying to do, is change as rapidly as the world is changing and try to participate in getting our graduates ready for the new world, which I think we're doing quite well right now. They're the beneficiaries, many of them, of some of the trends that you were talking about, Claire, and to try to shape the conversation going forward with research and many other means to, this is a moment, I know that Julius knows very well Paul Starr, who is a Columbia College graduate, first and foremost, but also an eminent sociologist at Princeton, who wrote a book called The Creation of the Media. I spoke at a conference on the book, and I discovered that the key concept in the book is one that no one can pronounce, which is constitutive moments. I think I've got that right. Although some people call it constitutive moments. Anyway, the idea is every once in a while, everything gets thrown up in the air, and then it comes down in a different place. And that may be true in all realms of existence, certainly true in the media world, and we are in one of those moments. So the journalism school, and even the president of the university, are in a position to have a real significant and meaningful influence on where things will land now that they're all up in the air, and it's incumbent on us to be extremely vigorous participants in this discussion, as Lee has done better than any of us by publishing the book he published last year. let me stop there, and if you want to ask a follow-up about one of these subcategories, I'll answer that.
So let's go to public funding. I mean, one of the ways to deal with this, let's assume we clearly want universal broadband access. I mean, that's how you get there, and I'm sure it's really hard and complicated. We clearly want that as a society. We want, all of us here, going through a place like Columbia, I mean, you want the world to have what it is that a student at Columbia gets. Everybody should have that in an ideal world. Everybody should have the access to information, and it should be provided by people who are experts and people who are not experts, but they've got views. We should have access to all of that. A lot of times we decide as a society that we're not going to get enough of something if we just leave it to the market. And the last 25 years has seen the dominance of a kind of free market view in the society for organizing almost everything. And yet, we know that universities could not exist if they were, as we know them and love them, if we put them in the free market. We know that science, basic science in the country, would not be done unless we had the NIH and the NSF funding this at very massive scale. We know we wouldn't have Yosemite and Yellowstone and so on if there were not public intervention to do this. So what are the prospects, and what would you think about a significant amount of public funding in the country going into this area of journalism? Nick?
A couple of things. First of all, going back to something Julius said, it may be that there is, it's not proven, but it may be that there is an absolute trade-off between what is socially desirable on the receipt end of media and what is socially desirable on the production end of media. That is, not all was great about the vanished age of big newsrooms by big established professional news organizations. I don't think those days are coming back anyway, but they were monopolistic or oligopolistic, and they had many flaws. But the fact that no one could compete with them because it was a very, very high barrier to entry business, and the fact that they didn't operate in the analog of what we now call net neutrality meant that, as economists would say, they could charge very high rents for what they did, and that, with some shaming and blaming from Columbia Journalism School, pushing the process forward, created these very big newsrooms. So I love your vision. It's an inspiring democratic vision in terms of the ability to get journalism and the ability for anybody to just go home right now and be a journalist. The most famous single line ever written by a graduate of Columbia Journalism School, I think, is "Freedom of the press belongs only to those who own one," A.J. Liebling, class of 25. Well, that's not true anymore, and it's a wonderful thing for the world. But if you get all that, which we should get and is wonderful, the other side of it is that the production doesn't get financed in many areas. So I think what we need to do now is engage in a period of very careful learning and debate on several topics. We need to be very careful about figuring out, and giving it a few years, what the market actually will support. Many, many, many people are experimenting with this. We're about to publish at the school a big report on what we know about this as of now. So it could be that ways of supporting production of news that are unfamiliar to us today will be there in 5 years. As Lee said, the situation is pretty optimistic for business and financial news being supported by the market, for example. I believe, based on what I know, that there are other kinds of news that aren't likely to be supported by the market to the extent that I believe they would be good for people all over the world. So then the question is, how do they get supported? The nonprofit sector is in that space more than it ever has been, but maybe not enough. And foundations don't like to support things on an ongoing basis forever. What strikes me is how many of my journalistic colleagues regard public funding as just a non-starter, because they identify it with, at the very best, trouble, and at the worst, pravda. And so I would like, and I know you would likely, to enrich that discussion a bit, get people to lower their barriers and say, the distinction made at one of our events that you were at by Aryeh Nair of Open Society Institute that I thought was very good is there's a difference between public media and government media or state media. And what we're talking about is public, not state. So taking people's doubts as a challenge, and these are real-world political get-it-done doubts and is it a good thing doubts, it falls on us to try to figure out ways this could be done that would be affordable, not self-negating, and not subject to censorship. The numbers are the least of it. Various cost estimates I've seen, in the scheme of things, it's pretty cheap to have a really big increase in the number of reporters in the United States. One quick final thing we need to also be disciplined about, there's a tendency, a somewhat lazy tendency on the part of journalists to say any person who happens to be on the payroll of a news organization is providing vital and unique information about the performance of public entities. So we get called on that kind of statement a lot, and we're right to be. Part of what's good about this discussion is it makes us journalists be much more careful and precise about exactly what in journalism has value, and that would allow this discussion to go forward.
So let's continue this, because I've advocated, as Nick knows, for an American World Service, something that would take the system we've had of Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and either shut that down and say it was right for the quarter century or half century that it existed, but now it's no longer, it will always be the voice of American government, and it has serious journalism, but it's not only that. And really fund NPR, PBS, and give them a more global kind of reach. This is what other countries are doing. I think the world is missing the kind of professional journalism that we could provide. One of the arguments is that will inevitably lead to government intervention into journalism. Of course, we've got the example already of NPR and PBS, and that for good or bad. But Julius, what would you say about what does the history of the FCC, which has had an enormous oversight and involvement with the press, a branch of the press since 1927, does that history give us confidence that we could have a significant publicly funded media in the United States and not have a serious risk of government intervention?
Let me start with a point about history that predates the FCC. We've had over the years, and Paul Starr talks about this in his book, a number of different attempts to get at this problem, typically related to the technologies of the day and the market circumstances of the day. And so at the time of the revolution, the distribution of newspapers and pamphlets through the mail system was discounted.
Right.
And it was an example of public funding that actually, according to Paul Starr's conclusion, was one of the things that accelerated the development of a journalism business in the United States faster than Europe.
Right.
I think we need to tackle, or let me put it this way. I think that that it's most likely that the solutions to the new problems we're facing will be new ones and not old ones. Now, on one hand, some of the core needs are the same. We need people like Claire Shipman in journalism, with her job structured as it has been at times throughout her career, where she has time to really dig into something and report and study and take advantage of her background and provide all those incredible benefits to the public. We also need today's Claire Shipmans in college to decide that they're going to go into journalism. And let me just reserve a question for later, because I'm actually curious about that. Claire and I at Columbia both worked on Spectator. I wonder what students are doing now today. So let me come back to that for a minute. But in terms of, the kinds of solutions that new technologies might allow that affect business models in a healthy way, that raise fewer of the entanglements and First Amendment concerns that come up with some of the older ways of either regulation or public funding. Technology allows for a dramatic revolution in the transparency of government and the availability of government data. And so everything from just making it really easy for a reporter, at home to just watch a city council meeting without actually having to go there, get data about what the city council is doing, what different government agencies are doing, in searchable, machine-readable formats, doing a kind of analysis that previously, really hard to do. So I'm raising the question of if you had a limited amount of government money to spend, how much of it would you spend on accelerating new technologies to provide all sorts of better information faster to people versus taking that same amount of money and funding a news organization in a traditional way? If we had to make choices, which would we do? Those are the kinds of things we should be discussing. I'm interested in these other ideas, one, because I think it lowers the costs of news gathering at some level. I also think it creates new opportunities for news entities to monetize information and can help with business models in ways that are non-obvious if you're only looking in the rearview mirror, but start to become a little clearer if you look at what commercial companies are doing now with data and how they're monetizing that. So, well, let me stop there, but I think it's a very rich area.
But I think the theme of this is a period of enormous uncertainty, enormous change and so on, and it's not a moment, therefore, to intervene with ideas that seem to come out of the history of our experience, but to wait and see a bit as to what's possible. That's the kind of, Claire, what do you think? Where's your
well, I've been struck
diagnosis?
even though I appreciate that, we really should view this as an attempt for me to stay employed. That's what all of this is about. Thank you, Julius. And that it is some days really, when I look around and think about the changes, it's hard as a journalist, having been in the field that long. But when I remain an optimist about what's happening, really, because there are examples of, my home state, Ohio, I saw the other day that, a group of, and you probably know more about this, Nick, but a group of the largest local papers have banded together and formed a sort of consortium to try to share costs, and they've come up with what they think is a formula that will help each of them individually be able to devote more money to some investigative stuff, and the general stuff is covered together. I just read a piece about a guy from Wired who is starting the Atavist, a great new online multimedia venture to try to for money, to sell at $2 or $3 for really in-depth, interesting reported pieces, and they think that might be a business model. And I also just think the iPad and what the New York Times is doing, the people will pay. But I think the big question is just how. How do we pay for this journalism? But I think there are some kernels of hope, and I think it's right that we need to let things percolate a little bit before. And frankly, we were talking about this earlier. I just do not see, covering politics in Washington, an appetite for, even as minuscule as the investment might be in real dollars, symbolically. It would just be, I think, a mountain too high right now.
Right. It's only
people to invest in.
We're only talking about $400 or $500 million in a $4 trillion budget, so it's really.
You take that to Capitol Hill in this environment, and
I understand, but my role in life is to come up with completely unrealistic ideas. That's
exactly.
In a little bit, we'll open it up for some questions, but I must say, I'm prompted to ask a question that moves away from the press area and goes into the university area. And what I want to ask you is, do you see universities sort of next in line to be going through this kind of transformation that the press has been in just for the past 5 years? Because actually, a very short period of time, that people in the press have been now exposed to the sense of disintegration of the world as they've known it. And I think all of us can just think back to 8-10 years when people thought it was impossible. That people would give up the newspaper in the morning, and impossible that the networks would be what they are today. Do you think universities are in line? And would that be a pity if they started sort of disintegrating in the same way? And people said, look, if you want to read and listen to a great person on Plato's Republic, there's a place on the internet where you can get it. Why would you want to pay $50,000 a year to Columbia to do that? Nick?
One of the good things about being Dean of Columbia Journalism School is that it puts me in touch with the rest of higher education, because as you know, of Columbia's set of Ivy League plus peer institutions, we're the only one that gives a journalism degree. So I spend a lot of quality time with folks from Shippensburg State University in Pennsylvania and places like that. I would be much more worried if I were them than if I were Columbia. What you're really talking about, I mean, there are these forms of aggregated human activity where each single piece doesn't have to stand on its own economically. And department stores were one. And you know, I don't know if you can still go to Woodward and Lothrop in downtown Washington, maybe not.
Yeah.
And newspapers were an example of an elaborate cross-subsidy scheme. I think Columbia's got, it seems like the safest of institutions, but lower down in education, you are seeing a lot of conversation along the lines of, let's take each unit of the university and make it justify itself. And where you really see it, and where I really value Columbia, particularly the college, is a relentless focus and insistence on skills as being what college is there to teach. Bill Gates actually gave a speech the other day, I don't know if people saw, where he said no one should take humanities courses in college, they should only take skills courses. State legislatures are all over the public sector of higher ed. Parents are all over other colleges. That you could not recreate Columbia University. So in that sense, it's not as susceptible to competition from new players. And the imputed and I think real credential value of the degree, the in-person effects, the network effects, all those things are so high that I don't think there's going to be a lot of parents saying, I'm not paying for any philosophy department. But that is happening already in less fortunate parts of higher ed.
Julius, what do you see?
I agree with Nick that a place like Columbia deservedly occupies a place in our society that shouldn't change dramatically, and I don't think it will. But also accepting the various things that Nick said about improvements. I guess I'd make a couple of points in thinking about education and new technologies. One is the opportunity for universities to lead on identifying the ways to harness technology to serve traditional goals and values, you know, reflected in our core curriculum, et cetera. Boy, I hope Columbia is the place that figures that out.
Absolutely agree.
You know, and then as an access point for broader communities. You know, however well I succeed and others do at universal broadband access, we're not going to get 100 gigabits to everyone's home, and there's going to be a compelling need for centers of collaboration that have super high-speed connections and that are collaborating nonstop with research and thinking entities in the U.S. and around the world, and I sure hope Columbia is leading in that. A couple of other points, just moving away from Columbia for a minute, very briefly. One is, I do think the opportunities for communications technology to transform other parts of education for the better are very exciting. And so to transform community colleges, to help that audience really become prepared for finding jobs in a new economy, very exciting opportunities. And to transform K-12 education. Here's a simple vision. We should be the first country in the world to switch from paper textbooks for kids to digital textbooks. The last country in the world to require kids everywhere to carry around backpacks with 50 pounds of out-of-date books, and the first country to think about tablets and textbooks as force multipliers for teachers that kind of inspire and engage kids and that equalize opportunity around the country. So I think there's a wonderful vision around that I hope we pursue as a country, and I think that institutions like Columbia can help figure it out and raise the value of education at other institutions.
Claire, just on the same theme, are there lessons, can you see any lessons for universities and Columbia in particular in what you feel the press has gone through in the past decade?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I mean, first of all, don't rely heavily on advertising.
Yeah.
For your income. I don't think you
Right.
do, so I think
Yeah.
I think the endowment's in good shape. And
We rely on alumni giving. That's what
yes,
we rely on.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a sense of wanting to hang on to the good old days and do things the same way. And if only we had 4 more crews, we could really be doing X. And I think that the networks and everybody's been struggling with this, but I think trying to look to the future, as Julius was talking about, for solutions as opposed to looking for ways to fix it from the past is key. And I think it's taken the networks a long time to get that, and I think we're still struggling with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are kids are just, it's exactly what you said. I mean, my son all he wants to do now is read books on my iPad.
Yeah.
And initially I thought this is wrong. And, it's just part of their blood. And I think finding the ways to embrace that and use the advantages, I think that Columbia would benefit from that.
Terrific. Well, let's open it up for some questions so people can go to the mics and
Looking at doing online degree and speak. Doing in a couple of years. Yeah. Maybe people at Columbia.
yes, over here.
Thank you. My name's Charles Schwartz, Columbia class of 65, law school 68. Claire Shipman mentioned the Arab Spring, and we've seen recently journalists being abducted, attacked, even worse, and it's not a recent phenomenon. And even in countries where there's a conflict and journalists are allowed in, they may be limited as to where they go, watched where they go. Is there a danger or journalists to become influenced in how they report, become inhibited in what they say, just as a matter of self-protection? And how do you guard against that?
Let's. Do you want to respond? I mean, one thing we can do, because we've got a number of people who want to ask questions, take 3 at a time and then respond to them as you want to. That we then get through more, give people more
So
opportunity.
Columbia's doing multiple choice now.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
My name is Saiga Thomas, and I'll preface my statements that I do work for the State Department. And I know that I was with a number of colleagues when we got word that out of Afghanistan, 12 members of the UN staff there were killed after Friday prayers in Afghanistan. I know a couple of my colleagues looked at me and stated that they wished that when the pastor in Florida first started making statements about him deciding to burn the Quran and all the attention was given to him, we said we wish that in general, media outlets wouldn't have paid so much attention to him. And we thought that it gave more attention and prominence to him than what he really even needed. So my question is, what responsibility do journalists have to ensure that the stories that they're going after are not just about how many publications can they sell, what's the hot news, or what's the hot topic, but actually what's a story that's going to give value and not lead to what we've seen across the Arab world?
Okay, thank you. And one more question, then we'll have some answers.
Hank Wallace, 70 Law. Can you educate the public to appreciate the basic structures of journalism? For example, it's common for somebody to say, Julius Genachowski in an editorial in yesterday's Washington Post, when they mean an op-ed, a crucial distinction. And somebody will, when asked, well, what do you think of the reportage of the various news organizations, will say, well, I like O'Reilly or I like Maddow, but they're commentators. No distinction from that, between that and the reportage, but also educating the news organizations themselves, where a sense of a basic thing like priority of news being subverted, where I hear news networks sometimes saying, we'll have breaking news after this message.
Okay, so we've got, I think, some interesting questions about, are we losing our concept of news? What do you think about the responsibilities of journalists to anticipate, to figure out what is important, what's not important, but to anticipate really bad consequences and to have that affect your judgment? And also, are journalists inhibited in their reporting by the need to try to get access to the... Claire, do you want to pick any one of those?
Sure. Well, on the first question, there are a lot of analogies to the time we spent reporting in the Soviet Union. And, in the early days when I was there, we were still watched, and we would hear if somebody didn't like our reports. And we were often, told, well, we didn't like that report, so we're not going to okay your visa to travel to Ukraine next week, or, but it is different than feeling that you're in real physical danger based on what you do or say. But I think there's a longstanding tradition of journalists who go to dangerous places and cover things in ways that really put themselves at great risk. And I think that, journalists are not really a bunch to be inhibited. I mean, especially when you see the foreign journalists who go into stories. I mean, they're there because they want to tell the story. And I mean, Nick can talk about that too, but I usually see people taking much greater personal risks than maybe even they should in order to get the story out. But clearly that can sometimes be a problem.
Nick?
I guess I should speak to one of the other questions, because that was a wonderful answer to that question. On educating journalists about these categorical distinctions in journalism, of course we do that, but I want to put kind of an asterisk on it. Two things that I'm proud of that we do at the school in the last few years. One is we require all students to take a history of journalism course. And the second is we developed sort of a business school style case method teaching with written cases about ethical issues in journalism. I really want our students and everybody to think about these distinctions, but remember that they change, the categories change all the time. In the days before cable television and the Fairness Doctrine, there was no Fox News to put in a category. I'm old enough to remember when op-ed pages didn't exist, so you didn't have to explain the difference between, and they may not exist in 20 years. So I think it's important for people to think through the underlying functions and how they fit together and how they've changed over time, knowing that they will change again, rather than to say, here is the firmament, please memorize it. I should say there's also a kind of movement in journalism education to offer courses outside of journalism schools called media literacy to undergraduates, so they'll understand all this stuff. And I will also confess that, I don't know if Michelle Moody Adams is still here, but I haven't even dared to ask her if this could be part of the Columbia core curriculum, though I've been urged to, because I can't think of how she could possibly say yes to adding another course to the core curriculum. The final thing, just quickly on the question from over here, I think the idea about selling papers is a little, it's not that we don't worry about that, and you know, there is something to be said, as we've discussing, for the market supporting journalism. I think I can say safely, no story abroad, no matter how incendiary, is ever put up by the American press to sell papers. If it were a story about Britney Spears being in rehab, yes. It's more, it's not that we publish everything willy-nilly. Even Julian Assange says that he censored a lot of the WikiLeaks stuff if he thought that it would endanger somebody. And certainly mainstream organizations do more of that than you would think. At the same time, you know, we live in a pluralistic society. The Senate behaves in certain ways because of how it's designed that are in opposition to how the House behaves, and that's part of how our system works, and it's different from how the judiciary behaves. The press always errs on the side of thinking more information made public will be good for the world, more open discussion. And I know it just doesn't look that way if you're inside government, and it's a creative tension that just does and should play itself out every day.
Julius, anything?
No, just a brief thing. I think, you know, the kind of activities that Claire, the question went to and that Claire described, the heroic activities of journalists around the world putting themselves in real danger, and the work that Nick is doing at the journalism school, it just, I think it reminds us that cultural norms and an awareness of the historic role that journalists and journalism have played in advancing our democracy, how important that is. So I'm just very happy to hear, Nick, about your focus. I think it's important. I do sometimes worry about whether enough is being done to sustain that, teach that to a new generation, given all the new challenges, and I'm intrigued by the core curriculum idea, because I think we lose a lot as a society if we lose these important norms. And I do think there's a way in which the internet threatens them, and we should wrestle with that.
Okay, yes, 3 more.
I think one of the most interesting and exciting things, but also one of the most daunting things I've seen out of the so-called Arab Spring was this proliferation of, I would almost say, grassroots journalism, where you see people with Twitter accounts and smartphones who are taking pictures and writing brief updates on the ground. Not even journalists, just citizens who are taking pictures with their phones. But then there are also journalists, for example, you know, Al Jazeera, who have bloggers on the ground, and then even governments and militaries. I remember a few years back during the Gaza incursion that the Israeli military had a blog about their experience, and it just seems like there's this proliferation of information. It's really exciting, but yeah, there's this trouble, this challenge of compiling it as a reader, finding out who to read, who to trust. What do you think the American journalist's role is with this sort of new development?
Well, you know, I know that, oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Just
all right.
do the 3.
No, jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I
We're
know
flexible.
that you know, when we cover stories, and I've watched the reporters who are covering our stories in the Middle East, we will try to sift through a lot of that. Now, I mean, that's part of the reporting job that they do, is not just reporting what's on the ground, but looking at what's been posted on YouTube and what's on Twitter and what are people saying on Facebook. And so it's a whole new territory. And, you know, part of our job, we think, at this point, is to sift through a lot of that as well, and to try to cull that information. I don't know if that's just a temporary phase, because it is really a sort of democratization of journalism, and I think a lot of people are happy to cut us out as the middlemen. But I also think that ultimately there are a lot of people like you who feel overwhelmed by it all. And that's where I think, you know, in addition to the idea we had about where is the payment issue going, I think where is the, you know, the information and things sifting down to maybe a few sources or a number of sources that people can count on that are doing that job for you.
Yes.
Hi. My question has to do with media representation of global South countries. And so there was an article by Guy Uriel-Charles on CNN, and it was called Stop Calling Quake Victims Looters. And it was talking about how it had a picture from Reuters of a Haitian man after the earthquake in the street, and he had food in his hand, and the caption was Haitian man looting a market. And they had also a picture from Reuters also of a Caucasian woman after Hurricane Katrina in the street doing the same thing, but the caption was woman finding food at a local grocery store. Another thing would be that there are dead bodies on TV shown all the time whenever stories of like genocide in Sudan is being covered, or they cover like victims of rebel forces in Rwanda. When those stories are being covered, they air that type of footage of dead bodies, but then that would never be the case if after 9/11 or the Virginia Tech shooting, like, of course, that would be very disrespectful. So it speaks to the idea that a higher value is placed on American life. So my question for you is, what is your opinion when patterns like this get brought up, and how do you address them?
Okay, thank you. Just to take another question.
Added to these mix of what's happening technologically, what that means for established news organizations, and then if you introduce the notion of public support, I listened to NPR radio just about every day, and you have to then into this mix introduce the notion of politics, because conservatives in this country have always wanted to cut public funding for what seems to me, as an ex-newspaper man, right down the line journalism on NPR. So this makes me pessimistic that you can have public funding or increased public funding for something which is really good, like All Things Considered, which leaves the question of the whole mix that might come to succeed the journalism as we know has to come out of the private marketplace in some way, and Lord knows what that will be or could be.
Okay, and it looks like we have just one more question, and why don't we take that and then we'll close with the comment.
Yeah, a couple.
No, there's, okay. Oh, then let's stop because we got two more. So let's take it.
Speaking to the last question, we have a beloved colleague at Columbia named Ken Pruitt, who is a former head of the Census Bureau, and who I know I talk to a lot about these issues. He's come up with a kind of master list of all the ways the federal government funds some sort of objective production of information for the public, and it's a really long list, and the number attached to it is a pretty big number, much bigger than we're talking about. And when you look down the list, you will see there's a lot of different structures than just the familiar, you go up for an appropriation every year and the cranky old committee chairman sits there and says, I don't like this. And without going into detail, that doesn't have to be the structure for public funding of journalism. There are many structures that have been developed over the years where there's sort of buffers and so on. The system you know, I'm not a lawyer, you guys might disagree, but the system by which federal judges are appointed, for example, is pretty good. You know, there aren't a lot of just out-and-out hacks appointed to the federal judiciary. So there's ways that federal funding can be consonant with a set of professional values that in real time create controversy and unpleasant facts. And I think we need to have that conversation about what those mechanisms could be with regard to journalism.
Okay, and we get 2 more, and then that will be it. So
Oh, there was the,
Though the other question, I can
Yes,
speak
the
to
other-
that a little bit too quickly, which is 2 things. One is, you're right, and it's really important to me as a journalism educator to try to raise consciousness about this. The most dangerous thing in the world, and it's very common, is journalists thinking, I have no biases. So in the class I teach, one of the first things I try to do is say, you have biases. Another beloved colleague from another discipline, Tori Higgins, a psychologist, comes into the class. He does this great exercise, should have him do it at an alumni thing, where he puts one half of the class with their eyes closed and shows a set of words. Another half shows another set of words, then he shows a paragraph. He says, what does this paragraph mean? Totally different answers because they've been primed. But the only area where I want to push back is a lot of people who aren't journalists think the publishers order journalists to play things this way. And that's usually not the case. In a way, the truth is more disturbing, which is we do it unconscious that we're doing it.
Yes.
Sorry, my name is Franz Strasser. I graduated from the journalism school in 2009 and went straight to the BBC right after that. So first of all, thank you, Dean Lemann and President Bollinger, for putting your signature on my certificate, because it doesn't happen often that Germans get hired by the BBC these days. But what I wanted to say is, where I'm sitting now in the office at the BBC here in Washington, I work with a lot of people who are paid by various sources. I have colleagues that are publicly funded from the license fee in the UK, and they present what happens in America today to their British audience. I have colleagues with BBC Persian and BBC Arabic who until now used to be paid by the Foreign Ministry. And I myself, I'm commercially funded, and I report what's going on in the world to an American audience, and thank God that Americans like Dancing with the Stars and The Office, because that's how we make our money. But all of these things have struggled on the same level, right? So budget cuts in Britain have forced the World Service to shut down 6 language services lately, including English in the Caribbean. And on the commercial side, we had our World News America program canceled from the BBC America channel because Top Gear reruns were added more money to that cable channel. So I do sometimes wonder where the future really is.
Okay.
Well, ask a question actually for my children who are in college and graduate school. The reason I ask here because my answer to them is ask their president or ask the journalism list how they can passionately do their learning in college. They say, most likely I won't get a job or get a job. I don't know what kind of learning could help me. And on the same token, I myself and a lot of friends talk about life. What kind of life in the future? So once we know we will be more passionately carry out our day-to-day life. Suppose the way we are living in U.S. fail. What I mean is democracy, open market, capitalism, right, all fail. That's which we like a little other country to follow us. Then what kind of life we will have? What is the economic system after the capitalism? Because we don't know. That's why we are so struggling mentally, psychologically to our day-to-day life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's use this to close the discussion, and any final comments you want to make. Claire, do you want to start?
Well, the BBC model is what I always cite, and my good friend Katty Kay, you probably know, works there, and I always feel so envious. I was thinking, why couldn't we just have, why can't we create the BBC? I mean, they spend, even now probably with the cuts, I think the data I saw was $80 for every British citizen on public broadcast money versus, $1.50 for us or something kind of. And it seems to work pretty well. I mean, in terms of being popular, and I know there are debates in England about is it the government channel or is it the anti-government channel, and it goes back and forth. But it doesn't seem quite as vicious as we get here. But I do think I guess we could only hope that there's something in the middle, because I'm not sure the model of that breadth of broadcasting really makes a lot of sense anymore. But I think there's got to be something in between, and I guess if we can learn lessons from what the BBC does, I think that it would be valuable. My hope was always, by the way, that I wanted to say this earlier, that when we talk about foundation money going into stuff, I kept thinking, why in those years when CNN was on top of the world, why didn't Ted Turner, instead of wanting to give all that money to the UN, create the CNN Foundation and just fund that in perpetuity? And that would be, I think, a wonderful thing to see.
Well, Nick and I have talked about how universities run medical centers, and so we've considered buying the New York Times and running the journalism school. Nick would become the
No, but I will say we're about to. I hope about to. I've turned on the switch for us to start at the journalism school a year-round local news site, partly for training purposes and partly to fill gaps, because we published a report saying universities have to step up to the plate, so we're stepping up to the plate. And it's going to be called, in memory of our founder, Joseph Pulitzer's paper that made the profits that endowed the school on the model you mentioned. It's going to be called The New York World. So stay tuned. If we were here this time next year, I think it'll be up and running. So then we'll do the New York Times after we show that we can do that.
Julius, do you want to close off?
I want to come back to Nick and Paul Starr, and this being a constitutive or constitutive
whatever
moment. We can call it transformative.
It sounds like an illness a little bit.
Yeah. It is a funny thing. You read this book, and the whole book revolves around this concept
that no one can pronounce.
And no one can pronounce. But we are. I agree with Nick. I think we are in that period, and I think the kind of work that is being done in a number of different places is it's very, very important to do it in an analytical, level-headed way that looks both backwards and forwards, and that keeps an eye on the values that have informed journalism in the past and that should inform them in the future. I think those remain constant. I'm fundamentally an optimist because I think I'm reading Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton now, and it's I hadn't realized how much of an early journalist he was in New York, in King's College, writing for the different local papers at the time. There's just something, I think, deep in us that wants to tell stories. There's something deep in us that wants to hear stories and to have information. And I think on balance, the new technologies that are creating this period of transformation, disrupting so many existing businesses, but they're also creating so many new opportunities for people to tell stories, to receive stories, for information to be exchanged. So it's a great time to be thinking about these. I'm pleased we're doing it at the FCC, and we're working with the journalism school and others, and exciting times, and I appreciate the chance to be here at a Columbia event.
Julius and Claire especially, we're very, very proud of you, and every time your name is mentioned or we see you and so on, we all think of our links to both of you, and so thank you for being here today. Nick, as always, thank you for participating in this. So that's the end of this panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Bollinger, and Claire, my former ABC colleague. She was always out in the field. I was always stuck in the office as a suit. And Julius, I just want you to know I'm using my tablet instead of a piece of paper. What a great day, yes? So my list of adjectives is growing: excited, proud, impressed, intellectually stimulated, and informed. You can add your own things to the list. I hope you've had some fun. I hope you've made some new friends and some new connections, and I hope this day makes you even more enthusiastic about being connected to Columbia. As you can see, you and your ideas are valued. So let's thank our host, the Columbia Alumni Association, once again. We want you to know that they represent you. This is your organization, a global network connecting nearly 300,000 alumni through 80 regional clubs and affinity groups. And in DC, we are represented by the Columbia University Club of Washington, DC.